So hello everyone, today I'm going to be interviewing Ethan Madarieta. Madarieta earned his Ph.D. in Comparative and World Literature at UIUC, and today CLACS is excited to interview him. He also has a graduate minor in Latino Studies and a certificate in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. Currently, he is an assistant professor of English at Syracuse University and is on faculty in Native American and Indigenous Studies, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and LGBTQ Studies. He recently published Land's Language on Mapuche Memory, translation in the Territorial Aporia with Northwestern University Press, asserting that the work of critical theory today must attend to an epistemic locality rather than the universalizing impulse of its European intellectual genealogy. Madarieta makes central to his study the literatures and philosophy of the Mapuche peoples of Wallmapu, comprising south-central regions of what are currently known as Chile and Argentina. So thank you very much. We're excited to interview today. It's good to be back here.
Yeah. I went out and walked on the quad this morning.
Yeah.
It was really beautiful, and I realized how much I miss this, the feel of particularly the buildings on the quad.
Yeah.
Quite a bit different than Syracuse.
Yeah. We picked a good time. It's nice and getting a little cooler, but it's been warm lately. So yeah. Hopefully you get to enjoy the quad a little bit more. I know you're really busy today.
Yeah.
And we're fortunate to be interviewing him in person today too, because he'll be speaking later today. So anyways, I would just like to interview you a little bit about your work. So in your own words, I guess, tell us a little bit about Land's Language, some of its interventions in scholarship, and its general message. Anything you want to talk about?
Okay. Yeah, so the book is primarily thinking from Wallmapu, Mapuche territories, and thinking from Mapuche philosophies or knowledge. They call it Kimun, and Rakithwam, which is the Mapuche Maputungun word for thinking or thought. So instead of theorizing kind of from the frameworks that I largely learned from a Western intellectual tradition in graduate school, for example, thinking and learning from Mapuche cosmology, as well as people within specific communities that I work with in language and culture, and starting there as a site for theorizing. So the book kind of came about in a moment when I was looking at Mapuche poetry and thought I really need to learn Maputungun, the Mapuche language, and because so much of what was happening in the poem, even though they were primarily written in Spanish, seemed to have an underlying index, one might say, right? That the words are pointing to a world that didn't exist in the language of Spanish. Even though it was in Spanish, it was pointing to something else. And so then it got me to start thinking about this, what I call the simultaneity and yet incommensurability of something like Mapu and land, where Mapu can be translated as tierra or land, but the connotations and the indexes that are drawn upon with Mapu versus land or tierra are quite different. This started to kind of bubble up as this potential site of an intervention in what is a maybe ubiquitous argument in Indigenous studies, the kind of primary antagonism between settler states and Indigenous peoples is land. What then when I realized, and what this kind of underlying thesis of the whole book is that Mapu, or that land, right, is framed within different and yet simultaneously effective conceptual orders. It means differently for the, say, Chilean and Argentine states and the Mapuche. And yet, both of those framings have real, very material effects in the world. And so then I started to think, well, this is not necessarily an antagonism because there's no analogy here, not analogous concepts. And that really got me to start thinking about the aporia and what an aporia can do, enable me to kind of think the simultaneous operability of the same objects, or the same named objects within differing or incommensurable conceptual frameworks. and what that might look like in terms of kind of radical politics, particularly thinking about demands for land back.
Yeah. So I guess the next best question to ask then is, how did you get into this research? You kind of spoke a little bit about how these ideas were starting to come to fruition, but was this something that you really did in your dissertation? Was this a post-dissertation, postdoc kind of research project? Tell me about that, I guess, more technical process.
Yeah. It in some ways emerged from the dissertation, but it wasn't a kind of revision or expansion of the dissertation. I came to the project because I was working specifically in Chile in the dissertation and thinking about performance and poetry during and then just after dictatorship, through a concept I was thinking about called expanding livable space, and how language and embodied practice in different ways would expand livable space even within the kind of confines and oppressions of dictatorship. But one of the things that I realized in that study when I started to look at Mapuche poetry, because I did one chapter in the dissertation on a Huilliche poet named Jaime Luis Reynun, was that the historical framework that had kind of guided my study in the dissertation focused around the dictatorship, which would then, of course, focus within the frameworks of an independent Chile from republic to present, was just a glimpse in a larger historical frame in which the Mapuche had been there, right? Which then, to me, signaled that the dictatorship itself and this kind of closure and livable space was also but an instant in a long series of closures by the state, by Spain, by other, sovereign European nations, colonial projects in Mapuche territory. And I thought that this is really where I want to start working. So I finished the dissertation and just had that one chapter, but then afterward, instead of kind of continuing to revise and elaborate the work that I'd already done in the dissertation, I said, I'm going to just focus on Mapuche poetry. And from Mapuche poetry, I got to language, and then I got to kind of on the ground political organizations as well as Mapuche philosophy.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Your work has really changed over time.
Yeah.
It's like, your dissertation is a completely different project. I admire that. That's a lot of work, and I really appreciate your ability to change your trajectory based on what really matters to you as a researcher.
Yeah.
I guess you kind of already talked about this. You seem to be dabbling in a lot of different ideas, but as a comp-lit Ph.D. and now an English professor, congratulations, by the way, that's really awesome. You seem to draw from an interdisciplinary body of theory and ideas. How do these interdisciplinary fields impact your research? Maybe how does interregional research impact your research? Do you look at other places of the world, inside and outside of Latin America? Tell me a little bit about interdisciplinarity in your work.
Yeah. So I think coming out of Complit has been, was essentially a training, so my fundamental training in academia was already multidisciplinary. And so I almost never thought of it, I never really understood Complit as a discipline outside of the kind of study of world literature, for example, and its kind of intellectual genealogy, philology, and these kind of studies, like Goethe's literature and things like that. But there were so many people in the program, faculty as well as students at the time, that were working across and with all sorts of disciplines. So I always kind of thought myself as multidisciplinary. And now being in English, it's actually been quite a change, because English has very firm disciplinary boundaries, at least in its history, and some faculty still kind of abide by those particular disciplinary structures. But I think all disciplines now too are kind of like pushing and reaching across, because the closures don't do service to the projects as they develop.
Right, that's something from my own field of history that I appreciate these days, is people are more willing to be flexible with the way they do their research. It's not so cut and dry, like traditional historiography anymore.
Right.
I think that's really important to really develop projects that make matter for the larger picture, not just for the tiny little historiography that you occupy, right?
Yeah.
So,
I feel like in some ways it's about method, and in some ways it's also about following the work in the directions that it takes us, and then doing the work that is required of us to approach these new directions.
Yeah.
Which also I think means getting away from this concept of mastery in our field, which I feel like is a kind of an intellectual shift in a lot of contemporary.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's important to be a humble scholar too.
Yeah.
To really put yourself out there and explore new facets. It really develops a good project, as you have shown us.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of add a different question here because you talked a little about your dissertation, and your book is actually a little different. It seems like you're really getting into like indigenous studies.
Yeah.
I mean, in this. So tell me about like how you got into that specific discipline outside of your conflict project on poetry and the dictatorship in Chile.
Yeah.
That's two different. It seems to me at least two different fields.
100% it was, and it's one of the things I actually talk about in my acknowledgements. Is that when I was here doing my Ph.D., so was Jody Berg, who is a big indigenous studies, critical indigenous studies scholar, and I never took a class with them, and I regret that so much now. But as you know, my thinking was largely within Latin American studies, and then conflict, and then memory studies, and I was kind of thinking within those frameworks. But then when I had decided, or kind of when the project revealed itself to me, that what I really needed to do was work with the Mapuche, I needed a framework, right, for thinking about also relationships between the indigenous studies frameworks that were specific to and from the Mapuche and peoples in Chile and Argentina, and then Southern Cone, and then Latin America more broadly, and this more Anglophonic indigenous studies scholarship that has, I think, come to be known as indigenous studies. And so between, I'd say, I got my PhD in 2020, started really doing this research after I'd already kind of written the dissertation, so around 2019, 2020. So in the last 7-8 years, learning as much as I can, teaching myself fundamentals of indigenous studies.
Right. That's huge, and especially during the pandemic, if you're starting in that period, right? That's a really big take on. I do kind of like I can also resonate with the issue of like the global north, the sort of like Anglophonic kind of tendency in scholarship for me. It's the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic and the imagery of the Black Atlantic. So I think that research that you're doing is really instrumental. Sounds like I should read your book too. So I'm going to kind of pivot away from your current book project and look at an edited volume. It's really cool that you're also working on this at the same time. But this volume is titled Critical Indigenous Memory Studies, and it's currently under contract, so keep an eye out for that with the Bloomsbury Academic Press. What has this process been like for you, kind of editing and curating articles for this volume? Has it produced deeper collaborations with people in your field? Just tell me a little bit about that if you can.
Yeah. So I think 100% to thank Brett Kaplan, who is here in, Holocaust, Genocide, Memory Studies, but also in comparative literature, and was my advisor during my PhD. She is on the board of the Critical Memory Studies series. It's a new series for Bloomsbury Academic, and had reached out to scholars and particularly younger scholars, right, to do projects potentially for the series. And I had been working on this idea of thinking memory studies specifically from indigenous locality and from a kind of indigenous nationalist context, rather than how might we apply, say, memory studies writ large concepts and frameworks to understanding the way memory operates with indigenous peoples. So she reached out to me, and I said, I have this idea, what do you think? And she said, write up a proposal. And so I did the proposal, and because music already had was working on this idea. I thought it would be a monograph, but no, I actually think it's way better as an edited collection.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big task to take on, a big project, and I like the inversion here. Using global North European ideas versus what you're doing in your research is really putting that on its head. Like, how do you put their epistemology onto this epistemology?
Yeah.
I think that's really awesome and probably really important for the field of memory studies and indigenous studies too.
Yeah, I think that's the benefit of the edited collection too, is that each of the chapters is by a person that is working with and within specific epistemic frameworks with whatever indigenous peoples that they're thinking with, or in some cases whatever nations they belong to, and think about memory within those contexts. Yeah. So the whole collection itself is composed of I think there's like 9 or 10 different indigenous peoples represented thinking memory, from the Americas all the way to India.
Yeah, these questions and answers have been really fun. I guess just one kind of closing question for you. Where do you think your research is going to take you next after these projects?
Yeah, so I'm working on a project now. I think, although it's, this just came out, so it's like a little bit early to kind of have settled on it, but it's a project I'm thinking called Mixed, on non-identity and representations of indigenous representations of mixed identities, to really think about unsettling the paradigm of identity categories that are either racial, ethnic, or cultural, and kind of fit these in, and then they become kind of a shorthand for understanding people and their positions.
Right.
But rather thinking about like, what is, within a Latin American context, something like mestizaje mean for indigenous peoples, and how is this mixedness showing up in their own representations and narratives? And I, find often that there's again kind of an incommensurability happening, where in the communities the notion of mixed is only really spoken of in relation to the state and its demographics and what it means, for example, to have an autonomous or sovereign nation that isn't exposed too much to the state, right? Through marriage outside of the community, for example. Right. But where really being in relation and being in place doesn't matter either kind of so much your genealogy as it is being in good relation to the community.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about what that looks, and it's way more complicated than
absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of tension there, especially with the history of Latin American mestizaje in Brazil.
Yeah.
There's really dirty history, and I think that'll unpack it a lot. It'll also, similar inversion with the previous work, it'll give us a different way to look at this topic, not just the traditional sort of top-down, looking at the archive.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. So
thank you.
I have to ask one more question.
Yeah.
So you said that the project is mixed. Is there a reason you chose the English word mix instead of like mestizaje or mestizaje?
Yeah. So I'm not so much interested in mestizaje or mestizaje conceptually as I am in the notion of mixedness, and just in English specifically because different indigenous peoples have their own notions of what this mixed identity might be. For example, the Mapuche have a term, and I write a chapter about it in this book. So it's kind of, the next project is a bit of an expansion from that, called champuria, and it's oftentimes described as thinking mestizaje from a Mapuche perspective, right? It's not mestizaje, it's the notion of a kind of mixed identity from a Mapuche locus of enunciation. And so I didn't want to use like one specific indigenous nation's word for it, and I didn't want to use mestizaje because it's not a project about mestizaje, but more about what mixed identities might be.
So that's actually expansive of what I was thinking. I like that a lot. Is there any other thoughts, comments you wanted to tell us in the audience?
I just really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much for setting this up and the excellent questions.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for your time, Professor Ethan Madarieta.
My pleasure.